Hello. Just gonna work on some code here. So to get you up to speed on what's happening, I'm trying to update the Coliseum. This project's 25 years old now. Very old. I got a few ideas, a few plans for what to do, what's going on with it. And now I'm just trying to figure out streaming in general. So give me a second to figure out what I'm looking at here. Give it a pause. I'll be right back. All right. I think I'm back at it again. It was getting a little upset at me because of my keyframes. Brand new to this, so I don't really know what that means as far as streaming, if I set it up wrong or if I'm getting lag because of my internet. But we got going on here is the code for the Coliseum. The main core of the logic is here. You can see starting at the top, these are the comments I just put in for what I'm wanting to do. I did some calculations just to figure out what was going on with the ultimate prize for the old Coliseum. The ultimate prize for the old Coliseum was one level automatically. You'd get that on average every 60 minutes. There's a 1 in 5 chance at 290 enemies. And 290 enemies would take 10 to 15 minutes if you were clearing them really fast. The strong character. So it's kind of weird because the stronger you were, the faster you'd get the one level. So it was really good for the higher level players. But like if you're low level, it could take you an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours to get that same level. Uh, this is all new stuff I just added. I'm moving the spots that enemies can spawn into a list. That list has been populated by an area that I marked on the map editor. If you guys haven't seen the map editor for Beyond, it's kind of like this. So now all of these Coliseum locations have a area that I can simply find by calling a locate function. And then I can add them to that list. Also going to move the kills to a global so that when you die, I just check the global and I see how many kills has happened at that moment that you die rather than storing it on each individual person, each individual save file. It's not that important because it doesn't take up that much space. It's just one of those things I'd like to clean up because there's no reason to store it on a per mob basis. If you think about it, every time you add a variable to a mob, that has to be loaded into RAM when you load up your server and you create a mob. So a lot of the variables, mob being a movable object, sorry, uh, mob and a beyond is a movable object, or you could have just a regular object, which would be considered a non-movable object. They come with a default set of variables. So, and functions. So all mobs in this old code base were given pretty much every variable, including things like Coliseum kills. So every single mob, even though it's not necessarily using this variable, has a Coliseum kill. You know, you take up, let's say it's 2 bytes. I don't know what beyond stores a generic variable as. For an integer, generally it'd be 4 bytes, right? So you take 4 bytes per enemy per character in the game, NPC, enemy, player in the game, 200, 400, 1000 any given time. That's a lot of bytes you're using up in RAM simply because you have a variable like this that you put on a individual character when you could have just made it a single global variable because it happens once per server and all players on the server are sharing it any given time. This is the old Kali function. I cut out a big chunk here before I started streaming and redid the old kill variable that was on an individual basis to the global variable. So if you were looking through the code now, you'll see this. My variable names aren't perfect. I change styling a lot. So sometimes I use camel case, which is where you go up and down when you change words. Sometimes I use snake case, which is where you use underscores. I really need to stick to a standard. Beyond has a standard, you can look it up. The original code base wasn't done that way, so I try and stick with whatever standard I'm using in a particular file. So if I notice that this file was using camel case, then I try and use camel case just so that the file reads consistently, even though maybe not the entire project reads that way. So this function called Kali actually should be called spawn Kali or spawn Kali monster. Spawn Kali Coliseum monster. And all it does is you pass it what monster you want to spawn. So you'll give it a type right there. And then you'll give it the XYZ if you want to give it an XYZ. If you don't give it an XYZ, then it will grab a random spot out of the Kali spots chosen right here. Assuming we didn't supply XYZ, choose a Kali spot at random. The reason you don't see more comments is I've kind of evolved in commenting. When I was taught to originally comment code in college, they said if you're just describing what the code does, there's no reason to put a comment there because as a coder, you should be able to read and see what the code does. As I've gotten older and more experienced, I've realized I don't want to necessarily use my brain to have to read what the code is supposed to be doing. So I get more detailed on putting comments as I go into code, and some of my newer functions. Again, I haven't touched this stuff yet. Some of my newer functions will have comments on every line, just so I can read it in English without having to read the code. I can do things like mask bugs, but and the way it would mask bugs is I read these comments and I don't actually read the code and I'm like, oh, this is what it's doing. And then I just skip over it when in reality the bug could be there. I could say add 1 to the nums variable. In reality, it's subtracting 1 and I would miss a bug like that. So say this was minus minus instead. I wouldn't see that if I just read the comment and didn't actually read the code beside it. So you got to be vigilant to make sure you still read the code even though there's an English guide right next to it in those comments. So back to where we were at. We pick a random Coliseum spot, we spawn it. we move the newly created monster that was created right here to that location. If we did happen to provide an XYZ, we can teleport them to the XYZ. This right here will happen so fast unless a user happens to get a screenshot in between a frame or the server's lagging really bad, they won't see the teleportation. It'll happen uh, in between frames. So this happens pretty much instantly if there was an XYZ provided. Otherwise, uh, it's just going to move it to a random spot inside the Coliseum. Finally, we return the new monster that was created in case we want to do anything special with it. What I'll be adding here is before the return, I need to add buffs based on item inputs. The idea being with the new Coliseum that somehow you'll be able to put in these items, whether that's in like a storage container or directly to the NPC. I'm trying to think of some way I can easily, with minimal coding effort, move stuff from the player's storage directly to the NPC. The upside is this is super convenient if you're wanting to add a whole bunch of items at once. The downside is if you're not wanting to add a whole bunch of items at once, you would have to have a house in order to access the player's storage in order to submit things into the Coliseum. Meaning it's kind of like a bar of entry of like level 20-ish is where people first start affording houses. But maybe that's good anyways. Maybe you shouldn't be in the Coliseum before level 20 anyways. I never really thought of putting a hard level cap on it, but maybe that would be a good thing. I mean, it's not a hard level, it's a soft level cap, right? If you're partied up with someone that does have access to storage, then that doesn't really matter. So the new idea is you try and put an item or items, as many as you have access to, in for every item. And I don't know if these will be the final numbers. This is just what I was thinking roughly at first. So every wyvern wing you put in uh, increases the agility additively. I'm not thinking multiplicatively. I'm thinking additively to the base stats of the wave monster. So each wave monster, if we go down way down here in the code, each wave monster, I believe it's here, unless it's over in monsters still, and I haven't moved it. Yeah, it is. I'll show you. I have this mapped out. So one of the things I do when I'm trying to work with this code base, since it's so old and so cluttered, is I map some of these things out when I first start. Over in this file, we have the different wave monsters. So it has their different stat levels, and then as the wave goes up, the stat base increases, right? So agility, for example, is 20 on wave 1. If you happen to input one wyvern wing, back from our comments, that would increase it up to 22 agility, but it would also increase your token multiplier for each one of those that you killed and each monster from there by zero point 0.1. I'm not sure if I should do it by 10% or 1% or a tenth of a percent. Haven't decided that yet. I'm thinking a tenth of a percent because over a long period of time, you know, you put in 1,000 wyvern rings, yeah, their agility goes super high, but if you're a magic user, that doesn't matter. And I don't want a 10,000 times multiplier on tokens unless that we just design it so that you have to play that way. Meaning you have to take advantage of those types of interactions. Meaning if you're a magic user, yeah, you want them to have a ton of agility because you're not going to be trying to attack them anyways. Uh, That would mean if you don't use item input at all, then the base monsters would be pretty much worthless because you're not getting that multiplier on there. To be thought about. So let's just say it's a tenth of a percent right now. So you put in 10 Wyvern rings, they're going to have 400 or 40 agility instead of the 20 agility, but you're going to get 1% more tokens. So if you were to get 100 tokens, you get 101 tokens. Man, that's a lot stronger monster. And again, it is if you're a melee user, right, or a weapon user, having 40 agility instead of 20 agility is a huge buff on wave one. But if you were getting 100 tokens, tickets, whatever you want to call them, from wave one, now you'd be getting 101 tickets for fighting the exact same amount of monsters. And if you're a magic user who's just casting meteor or hailstorm or poison cloud or whatever type of AoE attack you're using, you can wipe out 100 enemies in the blink of an eye, and you're getting a free extra token for no extra danger to you, or very little extra danger. Hopefully that makes sense. The other thing I want to do is at different wave levels, I want to add a multiplier. So wave one would be a 100x, or right. Wave two, every enemy you kill, I think should be like a 5% multiplier. So 105x or 5% multiplier. So you kill two enemies, you get one token, right? You kill two enemies, you get still one token, but you kill 200 enemies, you're getting 105 tokens instead of 100 tokens. Does that make sense? So on and so forth. Maybe it should just be 5%, maybe, of X per wave. I don't normally design in my code sheet. I normally design on another sheet, but I popped this open, was thinking about how to do it, and started talking through it for the crowd here, for the audience, and thought maybe they'd want to be able to participate in some off the cuff design here. Normally I draw this out ahead of time. I was hoping to whip this together and get it done in 10 hours or less. So that's the general idea of the new system. Put in items, fight, get tokens out, use those tokens to buy rewards. Have not thought of the new reward system, if it should just be like the old system, but with a few additional rewards. Uh, I like the infinite scaling of the game. Definitely need to approach the end game idea, because obviously some people have scaled beyond the capacity of the game, so that would need to be addressed. Uh, but with this type of system, we could make it so you could infinitely scale, with diminishing returns, similar to the way you level up, that you could craft a weapon, a blank weapon. The issue with that is then people stop hunting regular monsters and only hunt Coliseum monsters, because why would you hunt regular monsters when the returns for a blank weapon that you can infinitely enchant? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you'd have to understand the enchanting system of this game. But you could infinitely enchant a blank weapon, and if you could infinitely scale that blank weapon with diminishing returns, it just doesn't make sense to ever fight a regular monster again, unless you needed those regular monsters to get the ingredients. So maybe we'd have to add some kind of gold sync to this just to encourage people so that if they didn't want to fight regular monsters, they could just play Coliseum, but they'd have to have the golden resources to buy the ingredients from other players. Otherwise, they have to go out and hunt regular monsters, not necessarily for the drops, but so that they could craft items. You don't want to make the scaling so hard that it's unattainable, but you don't want to make it so easy that they never stop trying to scale their weapons and finish the weapon and actually start crafting on it, if that makes sense. I'm just stream of thought thinking here, design. These are some of the ideas that are going through my head as I'm designing. Obviously, I miss stuff all the time. I'm one guy. I try and refer to some of the more experienced players and say, "Did I miss something here?" And they usually say, "Yeah, this, and this." I'm like, "Oh yeah." But this is just, off the cuff, top of my head design session while I'm trying to get this coded in 10 hours or less. So we left off code-wise on the Spawn Coliseum monsters. Why don't you change the proc name to fix it? Well, because this was written by 12 to 15-year-olds back in the day, they reused the word over and over and over and over and over and over. And I could just do a mass search and replace, but then I'd have issues like this I'd have to look out for. I could write a regular expression. I don't want to accidentally chunk something. Maybe I'm just being lazy. Maybe it could just be done with a regular expression very quickly. Maybe I should do that. But I'm going to try to be as least invasive as possible with my surgeries. What that adds up to, though, is technical debt, right? Down the line someday, because when someone goes to edit this again, just like I'm doing now, 20, 25 years later, 15, 20, I don't know, I'll do the math right now. Something more than 2 decades later, right? I have to go back and fix this, and it's spelled horribly. The, for example, the old variable name that this is now taking place of was monsters. This word. So, if you went, for example, find and replace monsters with collie kills, like I still have it there, and let's do find all and all files. There's 446 instances of this word that are not the ones that I already replaced because I already replaced all the ones that needed replaced. Let's see how many collie kills I replaced. It wasn't that many, but I would have had to sift through over 500 different lines of code fixing this line to see if it was the right one to fix. And I did that already, which is why editing this code base is so time consuming, because what should just be a simple addition, something, if it was structured correctly, you could probably add in 2 to 4 hours, or modify or create in 2 to 4 hours, not counting testing and play testing and those types of things. But just raw coding ends up taking longer because I spent 40 minutes on that the other night. I wasn't like super determined. I was sitting there, eating some dinner and coding at the same time. But those minutes here and there add up a lot. Whether it's 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, they start adding up a lot every time you have to wade through some kind of technical debt like this. So the original name for it was Monsters, which is the horrible name because that's used, as you saw, at least 446 times throughout the code, the word monsters. So, little side note, if you double click on this line down here, it will take you to that line in code, which is really convenient for trying to solve bugs or search for things. All right, we left off spawning Coliseum monsters. This proc is called waves. This is the actual logic of the Coliseum. If the Coliseum is going or not going, then we're going to exit. If it is going, but the kills is at 0, so we haven't started yet, announce that we're starting on wave 1. If there is less than 30 kills, spawn 6 monsters between 0.2 and 0.6 seconds. So every 10, the way it works in Beyond, every 10, so these are milliseconds, right? Equals 1 second. So this is between a quarter and a half of a second. Every quarter to half a second, spawn this monster on a 1 to 5 chance. So this one spawns no matter what. Notice there's no rand. This one spawns no matter what. I mean, there is a rand, but it's inside of the 2 to 5. This one says, if we hit 1, so a 1 in 5 chance, spawn another one. 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 That's just a weird way to do it. It makes the Coliseum feel random, but that's what it would do. And then it would wait 6 to 10 seconds. Remember, divide that by 10. It'd wait 6 to 10 seconds, and then it would call itself again. Now, something you should know. It's not too bad normally when you have a function that calls itself, right? When you have a function that calls itself, it's called recursion. However, in Beyond, when you see this little spawn thing, it goes out in memory and it creates its own little structure to keep track of a copy of whatever procedures it's inside of. So it keeps its own whole copy of this. So it says this whole entire 63 this whole 250-ish line procedure. Let's create a copy of it. 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 Let's create a copy. So you get the point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 copies. And then let's do it again. Let's go back up here. Let's do it again. Let's go back up here. Let's do it again. Let's go back up here. Let's do it again. Until we get 30 monsters killed. Not created, killed. Now, the copies that you create do not stop until they get to the end code here. So they're each going to try and do this, and they're each going to try and do this, and they're each going to try and do this, and it can add up pretty fast, right? It's the reason it actually happens faster than every 5 to 6 seconds, or every 6 to 10 seconds, because it creates that copy function, and then that copy function, or procedure, I believe is what Beyond calls them, goes on to uh, create another copy, go on to create another copy. So they're each trying to spawn monsters on their own and their own little timeline. I'm not going to get into how the game engine works on one big loop, but just know there's a lot of copies running at this point. And then it's calling itself and it's running them again. And each one of those copies is calling itself and it's running them again. And they'll all get stuck in here until we have 30 monsters, right? And then they'll go to this next spot, and then they say when we have 30 more than 30 monsters, do a whole nother copy section again. Then we have more than 30 monsters, do a whole other copy section again, do a whole other copy section again. As you can imagine, this is horribly inefficient. If anyone's been around before I fixed the CPU issues on the server, If you tried to run the Coliseum, it would break the whole server. If you run it now, it still uses a massive amount of CPU because all this gets loaded into RAM. All this has to be kept in the CPU and processed and jumped around in, and this will quickly max out the CPU. So one of my goals is to change the way this is actually coded and get away from all these spawns and just spawn monsters in maybe groups of 3 to 5. And then if you do a sleep, it does something similar, but instead of creating a copy of the spawn, it just pauses that function and comes back and checks the logic later. And since we handle the prizes and everything inside of the death file, which I'll talk about here in a minute, the spawn doesn't really matter that much for what this is trying to do. Now, if I hit F1 here, can you guys see that? No. So if I do one of these, and beyond, if you're in the Dream Maker, if you hit F1, it will bring up the help. You can type in spawn, and then you could look up what the difference between spawn is. Run a statement after the delay. Important feature is the caller doesn't have to wait around for the spawn code to finish, so it keeps running this even though spawn's going. So it runs those copies. A spawn proc is a copy of the current proc. I'm sorry, I misspoke earlier. See these? See how beyond is tab? See these tabs? Each of these arrows represents a tab. When you tab over, it means it's not spawning this entire thing. It's spawning. It's making a copy of this proc here, and saying continue on with the proc we're doing, but run this proc. So it's not as bad as what I was saying, but it still is calling itself and doing this over and over and over and over and over and over and over until it gets past 30 kills. So it's not like it's not a full fork bomb, but it's a partial fork bomb. So the difference between that and sleep, for example, when a proc sleeps, it actually makes a copy of itself. The copy is what will wake up later, and the current proc ends. So that when you sleep something, it actually kills the current proc and comes back and finishes what it was doing with the scope later. So what it means is it keeps it in RAM, but it doesn't necessarily keep it in your CPU. Your CPU has to load that proc and drop that proc from RAM, but that is going to be less expensive in the long run than creating a whole bunch of copies or recursive calls of the function in theory. So I'll probably make use of one spawn. Why though? Why spawn? Why keep going? There's no need to use a spawn. There's no need to use a spawn. Just if we're inside of here, sleep, put this all the way at the end, have it go through the entire function. So for restructuring, this is pretty much what I'm proposing. I'm going to put it in comments. So waves, 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 waves. Very quickly run you out of CPU and RAM, depending on how it actually gets stored in memory behind the scenes. I haven't delved in that deep, but generally when you start doing this type of thing, it's bad. Bad. New goal. Makes sense? I hope. Hope that makes sense to you guys. All right. So we're in here, spawning the monsters. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly now. I'm getting tired. It's 1 a.m. here. Go to the next, this is for wave 2. Do the same thing we did for wave 1. I haven't looked at what mcheck actually is yet. I have a feeling it has to do with either counting the collie kills in the death proc. They did some really weird things with counting back in the day. Or something else completely, not completely unrelated, but like related off. But it's weird that they do it every time, every single time, when I can just count it once when a monster dies, right? Whenever one of these things dies, I can just add a counter up. It's already in the code somewhere else. I'll talk about that shortly. I'm going to try and wrap this up. So I don't know what's going on with the mcheck yet. I haven't looked into that. I haven't tracked it down. Something different's going on here, right? So wave 1 goes from here to here. If I were making this, I would probably do wave 2. It's an unneeded comment. It is, but it makes it more readable. And if it's readable, it takes me less time to develop, You know, time is money. So wave 1, wave 2, like if I were developing it. So wave 2 starts here. This is what's different. What they do is at the at the end of the first spawn of wave 2, and at the end of every spawn of wave 2, they see if there's any wave 1s in the entire world. So they go through every mob in the world. Blah. One of the reasons I created this area up here is I'm just going to go through every mob in this area and kill all the wave 1 monsters. So now instead of going through 200, 400, 1,000, whatever mobs we have, whatever events we have going on, creatures in the game and checking to see if they're a wave 1 monster, it's just going to go through the, 10, 20, 30, 100 that we have inside of the Coliseum. There's not even 100 slots, so it'd be hard to get more than that in there if I don't spawn it. If there's already one on that spot, I haven't thought about if I'm going to do that or not. If I'm going to stack monster spawns in the Coliseum, or limit it to how many slots are there. So if you get overwhelmed, you're just overwhelmed, and you can't take advantage of the timer going up. It's just a detriment to you. But so that's what that's doing. It goes through every monster in the world. If that monster is wave 1 monster, it deletes it. Very inefficient way to do it. This code was all over this. This was a big part of the CPU change. I think I saved like 10 or 15% of the CPU at any given time just by going through and getting this out of the code, where it would check every mob for random things like shooting a spell. It would check every mob in the game to see if it was the mob that you were wanting, instead of just like the area that you were shooting at. Wave 3, do the same thing we did before, but do it for wave 2 and wave 1 monsters. So now it instead of just doing one check on every monster in the world, it does 2 checks on every monster in the world. These ores actually function very fast behind the scenes. It's just one number comparison, but it's just ridiculous to do it this way because of this in-world thing. Wave 4, same thing, all 3. Wave 5, same thing, all all 4, wave 6, all 5, wave 7. Same thing, same thing, same thing. So there's a thing called code reusability. Instead of reusing one chunk of code and just changing the monster, they rewrote the code over and over 9 times. This gets really hard to maintain. If you want to change anything, you have to change it in 9 places. When I rewrite this, I'm going to try and just do it in one chunk of code, maybe this size, that can be reused for as many waves as we want. Uh, which will involve making this number variable, uh, maybe changing the Coliseum monsters to, I don't know if I want to have a hard base or a generated base up to like, wave 10, wave 20, wave 25, and then it starts just multiplying times that base. I haven't decided on that yet, but we could make this to where it could go on forever if somebody wanted, until they got to where they could actually die. Because the way it exists right now is if the monsters don't spawn, if they don't kill enough monsters, because it's so slow, it takes at least 10-15 minutes to run this. Could be really slow if you just got bad luck. They don't kill the monsters can't kill them, so they're just stuck there spawning monsters, but the prizes don't get any better. Or they have to force themselves to die in some way. And they don't want to disconnect, because I believe that kills their prizes, which I'm going to try and fix that too while we're here. So that's the logic for spawning the monsters in. This is the logic for starting that's the tournament logic. They put it inside of the same thing as the Coliseum. Interesting idea. This is the logic for actually entering the Coliseum. It does some checks to make sure. I'm just, again, glazing over this very quickly. It's not important, not too important. I don't plan on rewriting any of this section here, because this is just entering and starting the Coliseum. I'm going to try and leave that the same so I don't have to move anything. Uh, Empties out your your stunned variables and your shopping variables, and sets you as a gladiator so that the game knows that you are a participant in the Coliseum. Clears out the Coliseum and then starts the waves, which is what we were just looking at a second ago. Marble Door 2 is exactly the same as Door 1. They just use a different icon. Um, you wouldn't have to redo the code. They did. It was kind of silly. Mm. Coliseum ticket. This always drove me nuts when I played the game. So this is why I've been saying tokens versus tickets. There's an entry pass, and there are prize tickets or prize tokens. I'd like to get away from using ticket for both the entry pass and the prize ticket or token. uh, Depending on how many tickets you have will determine what prizes it shows available when talking to the NPC for prizes. In case you didn't know that. So the more tickets in your inventory, the more prizes it will show available. I already talked, I have not redesigned this prize section yet. This is the section where you choose your damage range. And it increases the number of tickets you need based on what you choose. So obviously with getting half a token per monster, this would not be valid anymore, right? Like before it was you get 2 tokens for a 10-20 minute game. Now you get 200, 300 tickets or tokens for the same length game. So this will be changed, but I could make this so where it's not a bunch of if statements, but it's one statement that calls a function that uh, allows you to put as high as you want, right? And we could just scale it with diminishing returns. I'm trying to decide if I want to have to be infinitely scaling or if we want to cap that out just for balance issues at this point. I think we've as a group, the people who still play recognize that we've just created an infinite scaling game, and we're gonna leave it that way. But do we make everything infinite scaling, or do we funnel that through the current enchantment system, or what? Again, I'll think about it. I'll talk with a couple of the players that I think have good opinions on these things, and they think pretty opposite. So that's why I usually ask them, because I like to hear both sides of what's going on. Enchantments you can get added to it. Most people don't use these because they want a blank weapon for the enchantment system. Naming of it, we can do that easily. Another NPC used to get the entry pass. So that's the Coliseum file. I'm going to save it for what I have thus far. Hopefully I haven't put any errors in there. If I did, I'll have to fix it when I'm not so tired. I don't actually like to write the logic when it's this late. It's 1 a.m. for me because it's a thinking man's game and I'm tired. What I can show you is a little diagram I just whipped together real fast as I was trying to map this stuff out. So Coliseum is the file we were in. It's what, roughly, not roughly, exactly 800 lines of code, before I added my comments. 800 lines of code here, uh, just short of 3,000 here, 800 here, just short of 3,000 here, just short of 3,000 here, and another 2,000 here. So I mean, I'm looking at 10,000 lines of code where this thing is spaghettied together between all these files. So I went through and I tried to mark what I would need from each of these files to look for. So the prototypes were the wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4. I was trying to say, I could just take those. Generally, I like to keep all monsters in the same file. So, there's lots of different design principles going on. I've tried to modularize certain things together. So things like monsters are always the same. You just take the same base, you change the stats a little bit, just keep it all in one location. However, Coliseum monsters are not used anywhere else in the game besides the Coliseum. So maybe I should take those prototypes out, put them in here so that when I open up Coliseum in the future to work on it, I'm not looking in a whole other file that's thousands of lines of code long, right? If you can remember that, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years from now when you open it, that's where they're at, then fine, you don't need to do that. But I don't have that type of memory to remember 10,000, 20,000 lines of code, right? Real quick, let me just, so generally, right, you don't pay people per line of code. That was a really dumb way to measure things back in the day. But you can still use it. Not that you should, but you can for rough estimates, right? So let's say a man hour is $100 for a programmer, right? I mean, you can Google this exact same thing. I'm reading it right off of something right now because I'm tired. What I was looking for was this: the cost of a single line of code is between $12 and $18. All right, to develop a line of code. So I'm looking through when I'm looking at this stuff. I'm looking through what 10,000 lines, $18, $18,000 worth of code that I'm having to dig through. 10,000 lines of code that I'm having to dig through to try and piece this together. It gets very painful very fast. So if I can take 3,000 of those lines off, right? If I can reduce my workload by 10, 20, 30%, that significantly reduces the development cost. Main is tied to this. Inside of the player variable is some of those Coliseum variables. I still have to leave Gladiator in there. I don't have to leave it in there. I could take Gladiator out of there, right? The way it is right now is every variable related to a player is kept in main. So when a player gets created, he's created in main. I could move all of that out, or I could just leave it there. The issue is you start getting into log in, log out bits, and I don't like to have log in, log out bits all over the place. So I can move the Coliseum stuff to here, but if there's a log in, log out bit, I like to keep it all in here so that I'm not looking all over when something weird's happening when someone's logging out or logging in. So I'll probably leave this stuff alone, leave it over where it belongs. There's global definitions. So back in the olden days, global variables were considered evil devil things. I believe if you use them properly, they're beautiful things of glory. So I'm thinking about moving all my global definitions into related to the Colosseum into Colosseum. So it's all in one location, if that makes sense. I'm too tired for this. Let's just do it the good old-fashioned way. Thank you. I cannot move my body right now. There we go. Nope, wrong direction. Sorry you're having to watch me fumble around while I'm half asleep. All right, death. This is where we handle when a player dies. There's two different types of handling going on here. There's handling token rewards on death check. So when they die, they get exited out of the arena or the Coliseum. And then we check how many monsters they've participated in killing. I don't need to do that per player unless I'm keeping track of each individual player's kill count. But they're entering as a party, so it should be the party's kill count. So I'm getting away from the last hits method, moving more towards a co-op method. When they die, that's how many they participated in, and I can judge it right then and there. I could just do it as a party, right? So one guy could just boost the entire party. Everybody dies and one guy just obliterates it. I think you get into unhealthy habits there. So I think I'm going to leave it as if you can't stay alive in there, you die. That's where your ticket prize gets cut off. The other thing that gets calculated in the death thing is adding total monster kills on death check, which means when a monster dies, uh, I add to the total uh, monsters killed for the global. It's a global variable, so it's just everybody took part in killing that monster. The reason this is all done in death is because death is handled for any movable object or mob we were talking about earlier, and then it has little if statements in there to say, are you a Colosseum monster? Then do this. Are you a player? Then do that. Finally, I believe, finally is the procs. This is the only places I saw related to Coliseum. Sometimes spaghetti's off to spaghetti, spaghetti's off to spaghetti, and then you get more files involved. But I narrowed it down to these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 files. Procs.dm, there's a reset Coliseum function. I liked having all the weird procs in one proc when I was early in doing this. I believe I created the procs DM. I can't remember. Now, if there's a procedure related directly to this, and it's not a big set of procedure chains and whatnot, I generally just put it in this. Yeah, it makes this super bloated, but I can always cut this down into Coliseum procs, Coliseum variables, Coliseum, you get what I'm saying? Logic. I can always break this into three succinct files, all related to Coliseum. So anytime I want to modify a Coliseum, I just modify a Coliseum. Or I can keep it all spread out like this, and then I have to hunt it down anytime I want to edit Coliseum. So the idea then is I take it out of here, and then this no longer is part of the chain because it's up in here. It's its own little thing. So with that in mind, we'd be doing 3 moves, and two of the code chain connections would still be there. At the end of the day, I can't completely modularize these away from one another. Beyond tries to give you some tools for it, but your code gets messy in different ways because then if I'm trying to figure out what's going wrong with a death and there's some weird behavior going on over in here, then I'd have to know that this connects to this. Whereas right now, I just have to know that this connects to this and not the vice versa. If something weird's happening in death, I don't go check Coliseum unless it's weird Coliseum death. I go check death. I don't want to have to go check Coliseum whenever something weird starts happening with any given death. So I'm not moving any death code into Coliseum. Same with logging in and logging out. Anytime something weird happens with logging in and logging out, I don't want to have to go check Coliseum. I just want to go check main. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Uh, Before I call it a night, I'm going to do a quick look at those files just so you can see what they look like. Monsters, here's the wave prototypes. So I don't know if I'll keep it as individually defined prototypes like this, or if I'll just move it into one prototype and have it randomly generate it with one chunk of code. This isn't actually too bad. This is pretty readable. I might leave it in this format, just move it into Coliseum so that I don't have another dependency. I'm still torn on monsters because right now every single monster in the game, except for a few quest monsters that I didn't do, and pets. Okay, there are places where things are not related, so it wouldn't be completely unstandard to just move all these Coliseum stuff into Coliseum, and then I'm not looking in monsters when I want to edit Coliseum, because everything Coliseum wise for the monsters is stored here. They don't do drops. They don't do anything special other than they're not tameable, and that's all defined right here. So, and they're all very aggressive. So, yeah, I think I'm going to move that out. Procs, this procedure, I have to go into this, what did I say it was, 3,000 lines, 2,600 lines of code, and find this anytime I want to edit Coliseum. Yeah, but you can just do Control F and then find it. Find the word Coliseum. I can, and I do, but that's a minute or two or five, right? Depending on if I spell it right or if if it has the right spelling. This one happens to have it, but and that's a minute I wouldn't have to use if it was over here in the file. So I'm going to move that over so I don't ever have to waste another minute finding that procedure or editing that procedure. Login stuff here. I think the main login stuff I'm looking for is Gladiator. So happens 9 times in here. I need to go see what's going on with that and then modify it if need be for figuring out if you're still a gladiator. The thing I'd be fixing is like if you were to die or you log out and log back in, make sure you get your prize for enemies killed, right? Yeah, that might be more difficult than it's worth, though. It just stinks if you happen to close your computer or something in the middle of a tournament or in the middle of a middle of a coliseum. However, the bug abuse that could happen by making it log in, log outable is something I don't want to have to deal with. Just make it perfect the first time is what a lot of people say, but easier said than done. There's a lot of creative engine issues you can take advantage of. Death. So I went ahead and added this. This was not here. This comment. Here's the logic for Coliseums. Here's where it does the announcements. Why doesn't it do these announcements in Coliseum? I don't know. Oh yeah, I do. I didn't do the announcements in Coliseum because how would you know that something died unless this called back to here? And so by making this one way, right, I go from Coliseum to death, not from Coliseum to death back to Coliseum, keeping the dependency one way, and I don't have to jump back and forth between the files. So they're doing something with mcheck here. Again, I have not tracked that down, but this is all going to have to be rewritten. You know, you're looking at 443. You're looking at 60 lines of code. It's not bad, but it needs redone right there. And then I think prizes are in here somewhere too. Finally, global is mostly just variables declarations, a few procedure declarations. So I'm going to move anything Coliseum related from here into Coliseum right at the top. And that way, if I want to know what variables exist, I check the top. I'll probably move this up to here. I can do that now. Actually, there's no reason to have it down there. And I think that's it for the night. I hope that helped you understand what I was working on. If you found it interesting, let me know. If this is way too long, way too detailed, you just much rather me go for my design thoughts, I can do it that way. I just, before I was writing, devlogs that would take me 20, 30 minutes to type up when I could just tell you what I'm thinking, show you in the code. So let me know. Have a great night.